All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending. My name is Andrew Berman. I'm the Executive Director of Village Preservation. We're a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to documenting, celebrating, and helping to protect the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. Tonight's town hall and teach-in is about our recently released study regarding the city's proposed SoHo NoHo upzoning, which would have a tremendous impact not only on those neighborhoods, also on Chinatown, which it includes, but you'd never know that from the information the city has released about it, and other neighborhoods as well, because the city has made very clear that what they are looking to do in SoHo and NoHo, they would like to do in similar neighborhoods throughout New York, which would have a huge effect, I think, by anybody's evaluation. From our perspective, in many ways, a devastating effect, and one that we really need to stop or dramatically change before it happens. So first of all, before we get fully started, I want to just acknowledge all of the co-sponsors of tonight's event, and there are so many of them, hopefully I won't miss anybody. The SoHo Alliance, the NoHo Neighborhood Association, the Broadway Residents Coalition, Lower East Side Community Concerns, Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, East Village Community Coalition, the Chinatown Mural Project, the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, Lower Manhattan Loft Tenants, New York City Loft Tenants, the Coalition to Protect Chinatown on the Lower East Side, 318 Restaurant Workers Union, the New York City chapter of the Congress for New Urbanism, and Downtown Independent Democrats. Thanks to every one of them for helping to get the word out about this. I know South Village neighbors did as well, so thank you to them. And we're gonna have a great program tonight, and just to kind of lay out the format, I will be making a presentation about the study, its findings, the city's rezoning plan. My guess is that's probably gonna take about 45 minutes, and then we're gonna open it up for Q&A. Beforehand, we have a couple of people who are gonna speak briefly who are joining us. We actually invited all of the elected officials who represent this area, or who in some sort of direct way have a stake in this, to join us and say a few words tonight about the study, about its findings, about the SoHo NoHo rezoning plan and what it means. And so I'm gonna just briefly, before we dive in, turn it over to each of them to say a couple of words very quickly. The first one who I'm gonna ask to speak is State Senator Brad Hoylman, who represents a small part of the proposed rezoning area, along with other neighborhoods from Lower Manhattan up to the Upper West Side. So State Senator Hoylman, please say a few words.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to see you. It's good to see everyone virtually. You know, when you're on camera, you realize that you're not well put together. So one of the benefits or detriments of Zoom. Anyhow, just wanted to stop by, and I'm going to be listening. My team, Tevin, team member Tevin is on this call. We've been following this issue very closely. We've weighed in already. We've been consulting with Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation and other groups, including Cooper Square Committee. As Andrew mentions, my district includes just two of the northernmost blocks in the rezoning plan. And the Cooper Square Committee and the NoHo Bowery stakeholders have offered a targeted approach that actually gives a higher FAR to sites they know as community stakeholders are viable building sites. But I'm very concerned that the city could be giving developers a blank check here. I know that's what your study shows, as well as an incentive to demolish historic structures, which we cannot let stand. That is really one of the guiding principles that we should have in this plan, is that we protect historic districts and historic buildings. And if you're encouraging developers to push out rent stabilized tenants and build higher, that's going to be a big problem. This is a crown jewel of Manhattan and the city as a whole, and we need to get on a different pathway here. The Department of City Planning needs to do its homework before coming to us with this type of plan. And the LPC needs to do their job ensuring community feedback is incorporated in the sites we're discussing. Frankly, I've got a lot of mistrust toward the LPC, as I know a lot of you do. And then different part of my district, just this past weekend, we believe a historic interior at the McGraw-Hill building dating back to the Art Deco period was demolished overnight. LPC basically stood by with their hands in their pockets in their typical feckless way, not preserving our city's history. I'm concerned that the same thing could happen here. And frankly, we need more affordable housing, not more luxury. And it's a stance I know all of you share, and we shouldn't be forced into making a deal with developers. It's a false promise for the community to have to accept luxury condominium towers with limited housing options, especially in and around a historic district. And the mayor's plan, as we know, doesn't even guarantee affordable housing numbers. That's the issue that I have, generally speaking, with mandatory inclusionary housing and other market-driven approaches. There isn't any guarantee, but the community is expected to pay the price anyway. I think there is a possibility, Andrew, of being able to tailor this plan to build more affordable, more guaranteed affordable, and protect the historic district. That's what we need to fight for in this plan. That's what I'll continue to do so, working with Carlina Rivera and our borough president and making sure that that happens. So thank you very much. I'm going to be listening very closely, and we'll be with you as we continue to ensure that the plan that we have before us has what it's intended to do, which is to build for everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. So I'm also going to ask another elected official who's joined us to say a few words. Also mention that one of the things we'll be talking about tonight is the Community Alternative Plan, which Village Preservation and more than a dozen other local community housing and tenants groups have put forward as an alternative to this, because I believe that we all share, actually I'm not so sure about the city, but all of us who are involved in this share the goal of creating affordable housing, preserving affordable housing, and protecting the character of our neighborhood. But the city's plan would not do that. It would actually do more harm than good in that respect, and destroy a lot of the qualities of the neighborhood that we care about so much at the same time. And so we are very much pushing forward with a way of addressing these issues, really addressing them, as opposed to the way in which the city is claiming they will, but really won't. So I'd like to also ask to say a few words to City Council Member Ben Kalos.
I want to start with thanking Village Preservation, Andrew Berman, Executive Director, and the 164 attendees. Oh my God, that is absolutely amazing. When the city first came out with SoHo NoHo after years of community visioning and a plan that looked nothing like what people heard from, everyone came out in favor of it, and that scared me to death, along with so many of you. And I want to thank Village Preservation, because the mayor has his version of things, which is somehow we just raise the city and raise all the neighborhoods and just build, that's somehow going to do things. And we need community groups like Village Preservation, all of you involved, to check the numbers. And I was shocked when I saw the numbers from your report. I'll be honest, I wasn't too shocked, because I represent the Upper East Side. And recently the DCP did a hit job on our part of the city, saying that we weren't producing enough affordable housing. And not producing enough housing, period. If you look around my neighborhood, all it is tall buildings. All we're seeing is new construction. And the reason we're not seeing new units is, if that's their only measure, you have to tear down 4 brownstones that are 4, 5, 6 stories in order to put up a tall tower. And even though you're going from 2 or 4 FAR to 10 FAR, we end up losing 80 rent-regulated, sometimes rent-controlled apartments to put up 80 to 100 market rate. And so we're not getting enough units of housing, and we're not getting affordable housing that's even getting replaced. And so the report, you're gonna hear a lot from Andrew, but I was shocked when, not necessarily shocked, but I was really happy to get the number of the fact that you have 105 buildings with rent-regulated units that would be threatened, and that the new buildings we'd be getting would actually make SoHo and NoHo less socioeconomically diverse and just less racially diverse, because all we'd be getting is housing that wouldn't replace what was lost and would be 75% or more market rate. And that's just going to make things worse, not better. So I've asked the Department of City Planning to come back in response to the great report that came out. And I'm hoping we can have a plan from the community. I appreciate Andrew's invitation. I think it's because I'm the only elected official who's ever actually led a community led rezoning and rezone to stop super talls and overdevelopment and bring affordable housing. And I can tell you, I'm in it with you so that we can actually get this done here and make sure that if they're trying to make changes under the auspices of affordable housing, that we're actually getting a community plan, not a profit-driven plan. So thank you for having me. You can always reach me, bkalos@benkalos.com, or you can call me at 212-860-1950.
Thanks so much for joining us, Ben. And I also want to acknowledge the Tribeca Trust and Human Scale NYC, who we've also been working with and have been supporting this effort. So I'm going to move into the presentation section, and then we're going to be followed by Q&A. So, you can hold your questions until then. I want to say a couple of things. I also just want to make clear, we reached out to every elected official who represents the area and invited them to participate tonight and to meet with us about this. Obviously, the two elected officials who you saw took us up on the offer. Assemblymember Deborah Glick had a conflict, but she's been very vocal about this issue, and we've met with her already, and we really appreciate her support. We're going to be meeting with Assemblymember Yulin now and Speaker Johnson shortly. Other elected officials we haven't heard back from since we produced the study and reached out to them to discuss the findings. And that includes Borough President Brewer, Council Members Chin and Rivera, and State Senator Kavanaugh. I hope that will change. This is really important information that needs to be addressed. And we are looking to our elect addressing it. And so let's talk about what that information is right now. And tonight is about arming you with information as this process moves forward so that you're informed about what it is that the city's plan would really do, because what they're telling you is not what it would really do, as well as what the alternatives are that many, many community groups are putting forward. And so we want to make sure you know that. I'm going to now ask Sam to also drop into the chat, in case you don't have it, a link to the report itself, as well as a link to the to where you can send letters to all relevant city officials, telling them that you're aware of the village preservation study. You know that this plan would actually do more harm than good in terms of affordability, diversity, and equity, and that you urge them to support the community alternative plan. We're also going to put in the chat, if you want to support village preservation so we can continue to do this work, how you can do that. And we really do appreciate it. We're a membership-based organization. I also want to let everybody know tonight is going to be recorded, including the Q&A, and we're going to put it out there for everybody to see and use in the future. So you'll be able to share it with other people, and even for folks who missed this, they'll be able to see what took place here. Okay, so let's get into it. I am going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. And okay, hopefully this will work correctly. Yes. Let me see if I can do this. So hold on. All right. So here's the report that we recently issued. It was about 4 months worth of research and documentation to put this together. And, as many of you know, the city in October, the fall of last year, announced that they were going to move ahead with a plan to, as they called it, rezone SoHo and NoHo. And as the details of the plan emerged, it had everything that our worst fears were about the plan including. And in fact, during the roughly 2-year quote unquote community engagement process that preceded it, the things that we and hundreds of others who participate most consistently said to the city that we did not want to see as part of the rezoning plan is an upzoning, which means allowing larger development than current rules allow, which allow a very, very generous size of development currently. And we didn't want to see big box chain stores allowed in the neighborhood. Those are the two key features of the plan. But one of the things that we did with this study, there were a couple of things. One is we intuitively knew that the plan was not going to accomplish the goals that the city claimed it would. And the city claimed that the goals it was seeking to meet were fair housing and equitable growth, and to create a more inclusive SoHo and NoHo as part of a more equitable and integrated city. We knew this wasn't the case, but we also knew that we had to come up with the data to show how much that wasn't the case. We also knew that the city's projections were probably going to be highly flawed, as they have been in the case of virtually every rezoning they have ever put forward. And if you look at this page of the report here, you can see we make reference to the downtown Brooklyn, Long Island City, and East Village, Lower East Side rezonings. Extensive studies have been done showing how incredibly far off what happened there was from what the city projected. So their projections are not to be trusted. And their characterizations of their plan and of the neighborhood are not to be trusted. What we found, though, is that even if the plan plays out the way the city projects it plays out, it will still make the neighborhood wealthier, less diverse, especially whiter, and more expensive to live in than it is currently. But the city's projections are flawed in so many ways, and in fact, it will probably have a much worse impact than just that it won't reach those goals, and will in fact actually be retrograde in terms of those key factors. So I wanna also just show you here. So, by the way, I assume everybody knows what we mean when we refer to Billionaires Row. So this here is Billionaires Row on West 57th Street, to give you a sense of how dramatic the upzoning is that the city is planning for SoHo and NoHo. The city wants to allow development in some parts of SoHo and NoHo at 20% larger than what's allowed on Billionaires Row in terms of residential development. And those are some pretty huge buildings. Now, just to be fair, the city is saying they will put in place some sort of height limits. So instead of these incredibly tall, skinny buildings, they would tend to be enormous, squat, fat, but very, very large buildings, but still 20%, up to 20% larger than what you see here on your screen. So let me just give you sort of a brief summary of what the city's rezoning plan is. So this is actually from the city's proposal, and I want to show you. Let's see, hold on one second. So this is sort of a translation of what the city's plan would actually do. So this is how they have divided up SoHo and NoHo in terms of these new zoning districts. We superimposed onto here the amount that they have increased how large the allowable size of development would be. So you can see in some areas, and we're going to talk about these a lot, what they refer to as these housing opportunity zones, and my cursor is on them here, here, and up here. The zoning would allow an increase of 140%. So almost 2.5 times the size of what can be built in these neighborhoods now is what the city would allow to be built under the new zoning. In some other areas, it would be 95% or almost double what's allowed to be built now. And in the most modest of cases, which you can see I'm pointing to with my cursor, it would be about 20%. So still a significant increase, 1/5 larger than what you're allowed to build now. And what you can build now is pretty darn big. So that gives you a sense of size-wise. So what we did was we took a look at the city's proposal and sort of what the foundations of it were, what the premises of the foundation of the plan were. And there were basically 6 premises in terms of both why they were doing this and how they said it would play out. And again, this is all from the report that we produced. The link to it is in the chat. Basically, the city is positing that the current neighborhood that they're proposing to rezone is not socioeconomically diverse, that it contains little or no affordable housing, and that the new housing that they would be introducing would be more affordable than the current housing. That the upzoning plan will create a significant amount of new affordable housing, that there's no danger of the proposed upzoning pushing out people of lower incomes or leading to the elimination of existing affordable housing, that the rezoning plan will make for a more racially diverse and equitable neighborhood, and that the proposed rezoning won't negatively impact adjacent areas like Chinatown and the Lower East Side. In every one of these cases, we found that these assumptions are faulty at their core, and the characterizations of the neighborhood are extremely factually inaccurate. So let's start with premise number 1, that the city is not socioeconomically diverse. In fact, while as we all know, there are a significant number of very well-to-do people who live in SoHo and NoHo, in fact, the array of people of various income levels in the neighborhood is actually pretty great. And here, this is, by the way, taken directly from the census and what's called the American Community Survey, which is done by the Census Bureau in the off years, not during the census, to get information about various parts of the country. So this is not speculation. This is not some, strange outside groups interpretation. This is the census data. And here's what we found. While 26% of residents of the 7 census tracts which overlap with the rezoning area. And by the way, let me just, we made this very clear in the report, but I want to make this clear. Census tracts, which are the smallest division of census information that was at least publicly available, don't line up perfectly with the rezoning. So we made sure that we used every one of the 7 census tracts that did overlap with it, several of which did include some blocks outside of the rezoning area. But they, here we go, here's a map of the 7 census tracts that overlap. So they include the entire rezoning area, which is the crosshatched area, and some of Chinatown, Little Italy, Nolita, NoHo, Greenwich Village, South Village, SoHo, whatever you want to call that area over there just to the west. All of these adjacent areas that are in these census tracts, which we had to use, are within less than 1,000 feet of the proposed rezoning, which is a standard measure that's used for analyzing the impact of a rezoning. Because rezoning, while it most directly impacts the area, the crosshatched area where the zoning will be changed, it without a doubt has an impact on the areas immediately adjacent and just outside. So the fact that these 7 census tracts extended slightly beyond the rezoning area is completely par for the course, and includes areas, especially like this area here, Chinatown, Little Italy, which we'll get into later, which are the areas which are in fact most likely to be most severely impacted by it. But so here again, so this is the information that we found in terms of the socioeconomic data. A little over a quarter of the people make over 200,000 or more. But as you can see here from the cumulative total on the right, there's a significant number of people making less than 10, less than 15, less than 25, 35, 50. In fact, a quarter, more than a quarter of the neighborhood had household incomes of under $50,000 a year. And in fact, almost 40% had under $75,000 a year. And that's important when you compare it to what the buildings that the city's plan would create. So here is basically what the city's buildings under the city plan, what they would look like. 75% of them would be market rate. Now, there's no way of saying exactly what the income levels would be of people who live in the market rate units that would be built under the city's plan. Somebody could win the lottery and buy a really, really expensive apartment, but have very little income. Somebody could have a family member give them an apartment. But all of these are the exception, not the rule. The fact of the matter is it's very easy to know and tell how much the market rate units in the new construction under the city's plan will cost. Because what we did was, and it says this all in the report, we did an analysis of how much new construction in the neighborhood, newly built residences in SoHo and NoHo sold for over the last 3 years. So we looked at a variety of different buildings over an extended period of time, but we wanted it to be recent because we wanted it to be up-to-date numbers. What we found was the average sale price for new construction in the neighborhood, not for all sales, but just new construction, was 6.437 million. Far and away, much, much, much more expensive than the average sale price in the neighborhood. The new development in the neighborhood is the most expensive housing in the neighborhood by far, and that's not really, shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. So 75% of the people living in these new developments are probably going to be paying, if these are condominiums, on average, almost $6.5 million. So while theoretically they could be of any income level, I think it's a pretty fair extrapolation to say that they're going to be making more than $200,000 a year. And in fact, by most standards that are used to evaluate what a typical or appropriate relationship is between income and what you're paying for your housing, on average, we're talking about people who are going to have incomes of over $1 million a year. Now, some have said, well, these might not be condos, they might be rentals. There's been almost no new rentals built in these neighborhoods in the last couple of years. All of the new construction in virtually every case has been condos. But let's say for some weird reason, they do build rentals. If they build rentals, they're going to be incredibly, incredibly expensive rentals with people of a similar income level. So anyway, the new buildings in the neighborhood, 75% of the residents undoubtedly are going to have incomes of 200,000 or more compared to 25.9 in the current neighborhood. And the affordable housing, the 25% of the new developments that the city would require to be affordable, and basically that's an average. They could do a plan where it's 20%, 80%. They could do a plan where it's 30, 70. There's a version where it's 25, 75. That's right in the middle. And it's actually the version that allows for the greatest diversity of incomes. So we decided to include that to give the city the fairest shot in this. And so in the 25% version, basically the lowest income you could have is 32,000 a year, and the highest income you could have is 98,000 a year. That is dramatically less diverse, and even among the affordable housing, dramatically more wealthy than the average income in the neighborhood currently. And there's a few ways that we can look at this. So let's compare this way. So if you look at that lowest 25%, the 25% in the new units that are going to be dedicated to affordable housing, and that's what's here on the right. As I said, 98,000 is approximately the largest income you can have under that plan, and that would be for a family of 5. And the lowest income as a single person that you could have would be an income of 32,000. Now, so let's compare that to the lowest 25% of income earners currently in the neighborhood. The lowest 25% of income earners currently in the neighborhood make at the bottom $0 a year, and there's a fair number of people who make between $0 and $15,000 a year in the neighborhood. And the top end of the low 25% is $47,500 a year. So currently the least well-off 25% of the neighborhood is significantly less well-off than the least well-off 25% will be the affordable residents of new construction. Compare that to the other 75% of new construction, which is down here, which again, those people will all be making undoubtedly over $200,000 a year. And 200,000, by the way, is the highest income level that the census records. So you don't see it broken down above 200,000. You just have 200,000 and above. But as we said, based on sales prices for new housing in the neighborhood, it's probably going to be over 1 million household income there. And that's for all 75% of the market rate residents. Whereas in the current neighborhood, the top 75% of income earners it's really only a fraction of them that are in that 200,000 and above category. And at the bottom level, it's 47,500. So significantly less wealthy, significantly more diverse in the current neighborhood than what you have in the, what will be in new developments under the city plan. Here's another way of looking at it. So these pie charts, again, show what new developments under the city plan would look like socioeconomically and what they look like in the current neighborhood. At the bottom, you can see 75%, the darkest color possible, more wealthy, definitely over $200,000 a year, probably closer to an average of $1 million a year. Whereas the other 25% would be making between 32 and 98. Well, if you look at the pie chart for the current neighborhood, you can see it's vastly, vastly more diverse, not nearly as dark as this one, dark in this case symbolizing greater wealth, lighter color symbolizing less wealth. So the 32 to 98,000 bracket, in the case of the current neighborhood, covers 28% of it as opposed to 25%, but that's not the main difference. The main difference is that there is then about 20% of the neighborhood who make even less than that, who wouldn't even qualify for the affordable units under the city's plan, and then a very significant number of people who fall in between that highest income level, which will be 75% of the residents in the new buildings, and the affordable units. So let's jump to the next premise of the city plan, which is that the current neighborhood contains little or no affordable housing, and that the new housing introduced would be more affordable than current housing. So just now we were talking about the income levels of current versus new developments under the city's plan. Let's talk about what the rents would be, or the housing prices would be now as compared to in developments under the city's plan. So this here, again, taken from the Census and American Community Survey data, are the monthly rents that people pay in the neighborhood. And you can see a significant number pay $3,000 or more, but there's also a significant number paying at the lower end of the spectrum, 8% or so less than 500, 24.6 less than 1,000, 39.4 less than 1499, 48 less than 2,000, again, for those 7 census tracts. And in fact, a pretty significant percentage of the neighborhood are renters. Currently, 77% of the neighborhood are renters. So by comparison, this is what the housing prices would be under the city plan. If the market rate units are condos, according to the city, 23% of residents of the neighborhood, well, according to the statistics from the Census Bureau, 23% of the residents of the neighborhood own. And according to the city, their average price for all sales in the neighborhood is over 1.5 million. Compare that to under the new developments, where 75%, if the market rate units are condos, would be owners. There's nothing wrong with owners versus renters. Both are great. But the point is that 75% of them would be paying, based upon statistics from the last 3 years, an average price of $6.5 million. So significantly, significantly more expensive than what people currently pay. And if you look at the rental prices, so under the city plan, only 25% would be in this affordable housing. And the way the city's affordable housing program works, basically the lowest rent, and it varies depending upon the number of bedrooms and household size, but the lowest rent would be about $567, and the highest rent for a 3-bedroom apartment would be about $2,161. Well, if you compare that to the current neighborhood, we currently have 48% of renters paying under $2,000, roughly even to the $2,161 that is the maximum rent that the new developments would have. Except instead of being for 25%, it's actually for 48% in the existing neighborhood. So again, dramatically greater diversity in terms of the current neighborhood, in terms of what people pay, and a lot more people paying at the lower end of the spectrum currently under the city's plan, a lot more people paying at the higher end of the spectrum, even in the affordable units. So the main argument that the city makes for their plan is that it's going to create this great boom of affordable housing. And if you look at the city's projections, which are not accurate, but let's for a moment take as a given that the city's projections will turn out to be true, which they never ever do. They say that their rezoning plan will create between about 1,200 and 1,350 units of market rate housing over the next 10 years and 330 to 498 units of affordable housing. They also talk about roughly double that number that might be created on what they call potential development sites in the years that follow. But they themselves, even they themselves admit that that is a long shot at best. So it really makes sense to look at the ones that they're saying we concretely believe would be built in the next 10 years. And that's about 330, that's 330, between 330 and 498 units of affordable housing. The gap between them depends on whether you're doing the 20% affordable housing, 25% affordable housing, or 30% affordable housing plan. Well, let's take a closer look at that. So they believe that on several dozen sites that they've identified, developers are going to build housing on them. We took a closer look at those development sites, and what we were shocked to find was that, or I should say not shocked, is that in almost 80% of the cases, those sites under the city's rezoning plan, the city is proposing to upzone these areas not just for residential development, but for commercial development as well. In 80% of the sites where the city says residential development will take place, they're actually giving developers a bigger zoning bump for commercial market rate development than for residential market rate development. So basically they're giving them zoning that provides more of an incentive to build commercial development than there is to build residential development. So it's not unreasonable to believe that in about 80% of those cases, or 79.4, it's very likely that a developer, if they do build, is not going to build residential, but is in fact going to build commercial. And if they build commercial, there is zero affordable housing that comes with it. There is no affordable housing mandate that comes if you build commercial development. It only comes if you build residential development. So it's reasonable to project that it's quite possible, and all of this is just making educated projections. But I would say that an educated projection is 80% of that affordable housing that they're predicting is going to be built isn't going to get built. Only about 20% of it will, because only in 20% of the cases is the zoning that they're talking about putting in place favor residential development over commercial development. And if you look at the remaining 20%, even there, the zoning incentive for residential development versus commercial development is not that great. So it's not exactly a guaranteed 100% home run assumption. If they build here, they're definitely only going to build housing. Roughly, on average, the zoning that you would be allowed to build for commercial in the remaining 20% of the sites is about 7.2 FAR. If you're not familiar with what FAR is, we can explain it later. Don't worry about it. But it's basically, it's a function that tells you how big what you can build is. By comparison, for commercial development, and this, by the way, we're talking about market rate, because market rate is what they what incentivizes them to build. They don't make money really off of the affordable units for the most part. The zoning for commercial development would be about 6.5. So it's more, in 20% of the cases, the zoning incentive is more for residential, but not so much more that it's a slam dunk that that's what you're going to see built there. So even in that 20% of cases, it's not a guarantee. So basically, at the end of the day, the city is saying 330 to 498 units of affordable housing to be created. A much more reasonable projection is that only about 20% of that will be built, which is only between 68 and 103 units of affordable housing that would be created under the mayor's plan. Now, beyond that, and this isn't even counting that factor, the city is already in there among those 330 to 498 units of affordable housing. For instance, they've said that this site on the Bowery at 4th Street is one of the development sites where they anticipate 27 units of affordable housing will be built. Well, in fact, a developer there is already moving ahead with a commercial development with no affordable housing on it whatsoever. So clearly the city's projections are highly, highly, highly flawed. Premise number 4 of the city's plan: there's no danger of the proposed upzoning pushing out people of lower incomes or leading to the elimination of existing affordable housing. This is simply not based on facts or borne out by reality, and this is one of the most dangerous parts of the city's plan. They categorically, in their environmental impact statement, say any building that has rent-regulated units in it, there's no chance of it being demolished. No chance, can't happen. We're going to assume that that will never happen, and none of our projections take into account that possibility. We've identified 635 rent-regulated units in 105 buildings within the rezoning area, not within the 7 census tracts, specifically within the rezoning area, because that's not something you research through the census, you research it through other places. And there we were actually able to identify it address by address. So 635 rent-regulated units in 105 buildings. Here's the deal with those. Almost all of those are in 4, 5, 6, 7-story buildings. Under the existing zoning, there's not a huge incentive to tear down a 4, 5, 6, or 7-story building in the neighborhood, because what you could build is not necessarily that much bigger than it. Under the proposed rezoning, you could build a dramatically larger building. So suddenly there is a great economic incentive to tear down these 4, 5, 6, 7-story buildings that have either rent regulated or loft law units in them. So the rezoning creates a tremendous incentive to eliminate and demolish rent-regulated units. Now, let me also say this. One of the things that we've been getting pushback on or questions from people about is, well, but how do you get rid of rent-regulated units? The law says you can't do that. So actually, until very recently, it was very, very easy to get rid of rent-regulated units, unfortunately, because there were all these loopholes. There was the luxury decontrol, vacancy decontrol, major capital improvements, which allowed you to bump up the rents. In 2019, the state legislature tightened all of those loopholes, making it very, very hard to remove units from the rent regulation system the way that you used to, which is great, which means it's now going to be far, far easier to hold on to these rent-regulated units. The one exception is demolition. You can still get rid of rent-regulated units by demolition. Now, the pushback we get from some people is saying, well, but technically, you're not supposed to be able to demolish a building with rent-regulated units in them unless the rent-regulated tenants agree to it and they want to leave. The reality is, in many, many, many cases, they're harassed out, they're pushed out, they're bought out. Either way, what happens is rent-regulated units are eliminated. So this plan is going to incentivize the elimination of rent-regulated units and the pushing out of people who live in those rent-regulated units. And just to give you an example of the difference between the incentive to do that now under the current zoning and the incentive to do it under what would be the new zoning. So here are some examples. This is 202 Hester Street. It has rent-regulated units in it according to public records that we were able to access. The blue here, the blue overlay, shows you what can be built under the existing zoning, roughly. It's a sort of representation of it. This building is built to 4.5 FAR, and under the existing zoning, you can build to 5 FAR. So it's built almost as big as you can currently build it. So there's really not a lot of incentive there to demolish. This, on the right-hand side, is what you would be able to build under the existing zoning. And again, these blue things don't show you literally the size of the building. It's a graphic representation of the number of square feet that you get to build. So under the new zoning, you would get to build up to 12 FAR, which is dramatically bigger than the existing building. So suddenly there is a dramatically increased incentive to demolish the building because what you could build there is so much bigger and therefore so much more profitable than what is there now. And there are literally dozens and dozens of these buildings. And these are just some of the examples that we used and pointed out to show rent-regulated buildings built in most cases fairly close to the limit of what you could build. So not a lot of incentives to push people out or to demolish the building. But under the new zoning, tremendously increased incentive to push people out and demolish the building. So the city claims that these units shouldn't be considered vulnerable to demolition because state laws make demolition of rent-regulated units difficult, which we discussed a little bit, and because most of the proposed rezoning area is located within designated historic districts, which would prevent demolition. But these are false assumptions for a couple of reasons. One is, yes, the rent regulation protections do make it difficult, but far from impossible to get rid of, to demolish rent-regulated buildings. And here, we're not even this isn't our specialty, but without it being our specialty, we are aware of many, many cases of buildings with rent-regulated or loft law units that either have been demolished recently in this immediate vicinity, or developers are planning to and moving ahead with demolition. Right here, you can see 112 to 120 East 11th Street, 5 walk-up buildings full of rent-regulated tenants, demolished about 4 or 5 years ago, right across the street from Webster Hall for that hideous new Moxie Hotel that was built in its place. And the reason why was because the zoning allowed 6 FAR. The buildings were about 3.9 FAR. So a fairly significant difference, actually not nearly as significant as the difference would be under the proposed SoHo NoHo upzoning for buildings in that neighborhood. But even with that medium-sized difference, there was enough of an incentive to demolish. Here's 827, 831 Broadway. Hasn't been demolished yet, but a developer had in fact filed plans to demolish it and was planning to demolish it. It had loft law units in it. Had we not gotten the building landmarked, it would have been demolished. Here are just a couple of other examples, again, right here in our vicinity. This is a little more comparable to what would happen in SoHo and NoHo. This is a building, 1416 Fifth Avenue, built to about 3.21 FAR. The allowable FAR was 10, actually bonusable up to 12, much like what would be in a lot of SoHo and NoHo. A developer came along, bought the buildings, cleared out all 20 units. About half of them were rent-regulated units, longtime tenants, and they are preparing to demolish the building. They're going through a process of getting permission from the Landmarks Preservation Commission to demolish it. Then lastly, over here, 102 Charlton Street. These are just examples. This is not an exhaustive category by any means. So demolition of rent-regulated buildings takes place in our area where there's tremendous development pressure all the time. And the bigger the differential between how big the building is currently and how big you can build increases the likelihood of that demolition taking place. So for anyone to say you can't get rid of rent-regulated tenants and demolish buildings, they're just not speaking to reality. Now, in terms of this issue of, well, so much of the proposed rezoning area is in historic districts and you can't demolish buildings in historic districts, this is unfortunately also untrue in several key respects. First of all, a pretty significant percentage of the area that the city is proposing to rezone is either not in the historic district or the buildings are where, let me rephrase that, a significant percentage of the rent regulated and loft law buildings located in the rezoning area are not in the historic districts. And even of the ones that are, there are a fair number that are considered no style buildings, which means that, so first of all, if it's outside the historic district, there's no landmarks regulation preventing you from demolishing it. And even if it's in the historic district, but considered a no style building, basically you're going to be able to demolish it. So even though only about 10% of the proposed rezoning is located outside of historic districts, we found that 30% of the rent regulated housing in the area is outside of the historic districts or is considered a no style building in the historic district. So disproportionately, those buildings are in fact lacking in the landmark protections. We also found, by the way, that the rent regulated units are disproportionately located in the areas where the city is proposing the largest upzonings and thus making them especially vulnerable to demolition. So those 3 areas where I told you, where you saw the 140%, 2.4 times the size of you could build new buildings 2.4 times the size of what the current rules would allow you to build, those 3 areas at the corners of the proposed rezoning. That's only about 5% of the rezoning area, but it accounts for more than 21% of the rent regulated units in the rezoning area. So the rent regulated units, the rent protected units, the units that are more affordable and tend to house more people of modest incomes paying lower rent, they are disproportionately located in exactly the area that the city is targeting for the biggest upzoning, and therefore creating the biggest pressure for demolition of buildings. Finally, even within historic districts, even for those buildings that are considered significant contributing buildings to historic districts, the Landmarks Preservation Commission allows you to demolish enough of the building that under rent regulation rules, it would count as demolition. As far as the LPC is concerned, you're preserving the building because you're keeping the facade, but as far as rent regulation rules go, you're demolishing the building. So even within historic districts, even for high style, historically significant buildings, the fact that they're in historic districts doesn't offer complete protection against the loss of the rent regulated units by demolition. And here are just some examples in our vicinity where the Landmarks Preservation Commission has approved demolition of landmarked contributing buildings of basically everything except the facade, which would get rid of those rent regulated units. They would qualify as demolished, but technically speaking, under landmarks regulations, you wouldn't be demolishing the building. And so even with the landmarks rules in effect, you would still lose the rent regulated units. This is the reality that the city is seeking to deny. So in sum, this graphic here kind of shows you what's very, very likely to happen under the city's proposed rezoning in terms of buildings with rent regulated units. This is a classic example of a building with rent regulated units, a 5-story walk-up building. There will be tremendous incentive to demolish it and either replace it with a residential development at 12 FAR, which will be by far mostly market rate, super luxury. If they're condos, again, an average sales price probably of just shy of 6.5 million, average incomes of probably about $1 million a year or more, with just 25% affordable. But in about 80% of the cases, the much greater likelihood is you're going to get this. You're going to get the rent regulated building demolished just to make way for commercial development with no affordable housing in it whatsoever. This means an office building, potentially hotels, a variety of different kinds of commercial uses would be allowed. So let's get into the issue of, we've talked about socioeconomic diversity. Let's talk about racial diversity. So the city claims that their rezoning plan will make for a much more racially diverse and equitable neighborhood. So again, using these 7 census tracts, this is the breakdown of what the racial composition is of the neighborhood currently. And again, it's not our estimation, it's none of that. This is census data and American Community Survey figures. 60% white, 28.4% Asian, 6.8% Hispanic, 1.6% African American, roughly 3.5% mixed or other. And by the way, that data also showed us that about 1/3 of the residents of the neighborhood were born outside of the United States. Nearly 2/3 of those who were foreign born were born in Asia. And of those who were born in Asia, about half were born in China. So, you know, it's obviously there's no way of saying for sure exactly what the racial composition will be of new developments in the neighborhood. But what you can do is make some reasonable extrapolations based on the income of the people who will be living there. So again, this is the racial composition of the 7 census tracts that includes this neighborhood. And by the way, I just want to sort of point something out here. We've gotten some howls from some of the haters out here that we skewed our data because we included census tracts that, let me show you, because we included census tracts that include Chinatown. that we included blocks that include parts of Chinatown that aren't in the rezoning, and we purposely did that to skew the data. We didn't do anything purposely. We took the 7 census tracts that overlap with this, and it grabbed also parts of Greenwich Village, NoHo, Nolita, South Village, etc. By the way, all of these areas, high income, expensive, predominantly white, they didn't mind or howl that we also pulled in blocks that would tend to skew the data towards being whiter, higher income, higher housing prices. They were only upset that there happened to be some blocks that included lower income Asian American residents that were also pulled in, who do also live directly inside the rezoning area. And let me just show you. So these are buildings that are all located within the rezoning area that the city is proposing to rezone, not in the blocks just outside of it that happen to be within the neighboring census tracts. These are buildings within the rezoning area. And in a lot of cases, they are buildings that are probably going to get demolished as a result of the rezoning. That southeastern housing opportunity zone where the city is proposing the largest upzoning, census data shows that it is a majority or plurality, I forget, Asian American. So in fact, there are many, many Asian American residents of the neighborhood, many of whom live in these older walk-up tenements that are going to be disproportionately endangered by the proposed rezoning because they are in the area where the rezoning would be the most dramatic. By the way, these are some of the buildings that are also in those adjacent blocks that were pulled into our data because they just happen to be in the same census tracts. Apartment buildings that I would say, because I know them fairly well. By far, the majority of the residents are white. In many cases, they're fairly high income. In almost all cases, they're paying fairly high prices for their housing. No objections that those were included in the data, and nobody's saying, oh, take that out, you're skewing the data. The only thing they wanted taken out of the data was where there were Chinese and Asian American blocks that were included. So let's go back. So again, this is the racial composition of the current neighborhood for those 7 census tracts. Basically what we did was we applied the income levels for, in the new developments, 75% market rate. I think it would be impossible to argue that the 75% market rate, that people wouldn't be at least in that uppermost census category of income, which is 200,000 and above. And then we took for the remaining 25%, the affordable units, the income categories of people who would live there. And we extrapolated, so if the people who live there reflect their income citywide, in other words, if the people who live there, the proportions of Black, white, Latino, Asian reflect what citywide for those income bands they are, under using a citywide model, this is what the racial breakdown of new buildings would look like. As you can see, it's much wider than this, much less Asian American. There is an increase in the Black percentage. There's a decrease in the Latino percentage. If, however, you use a borough-wide model, which is probably a more likely reflection, it gets even less diverse, 73.5% white as compared to 59.8% white. Still a dramatically decreased percentage of Asian Americans. The Black percentage is, while somewhat higher than the current, is less than under the citywide, and still a fairly small percentage. And the Hispanic or Latino percentage is still less than currently. Now, by the way, all of this assumes that the city does not use for the affordable units what's called community preference, which as of right now they do use, which means that under community preference, half of the units in the affordable component of the new developments, the 25%, have to be from the local community board. So if the city does in fact use community preference for those units, which currently they are supposed to and is their practice, the percentage of white residents will be in these new developments even higher than it is now. The percentage of Hispanics probably won't change very much. The percentage of Black residents would be lower, and the percentage of Asian American residents would be slightly higher than what is projected under the citywide or the borough-wide model. And that's what we're comparing it to, by the way. So basically, community preference would, for the most part, make the lack of diversity issue, depending on how you slice it, a little worse or a little better. The new buildings would be whiter, but they'd also be a little more Asian American, still dramatically less Asian American than the current composition of the neighborhood. So it is a falsehood to say that the new buildings that the city's rezoning would produce would create either a more affordable neighborhood than currently exists. It would be, the housing would be overall less affordable, including the quote unquote affordable housing. It's a lie to say that it would create more socioeconomic diversity. The new buildings would be skewed dramatically towards wealthier people, even the affordable housing part of it as compared to the 25% least well off in the existing neighborhood. And in terms of racial diversity, it would actually not be helpful. It would be, in most respects, not all, but most respects, harmful in the sense that the white percentage would go dramatically up and the Asian American percentage would go dramatically down. So we got one more premise from the city's plan to hit on here. And I'm just going to get rid of that. So the city completely dodges talking about the impact at all that the proposed rezoning would have on neighboring areas, which are even more racially and socioeconomically diverse than the proposed rezoning area, and have people of even lower incomes. So for instance, we took a look at this area here of Chinatown, also the old Little Italy around Mulberry Street, basically just a few blocks right next to this housing opportunity zone, as the city calls it, where they would have the most dramatic upzoning. So these few blocks here. Within this area, we found an even more dramatically high concentration of rent-regulated units. In fact, public records showed 1,257 rent-regulated units in this area. Now, this area is not proposed to be rezoned, but it's directly adjacent to it. So imagine the rezoning happens and all of a sudden you start getting these huge, predominantly luxury condo towers, boutique office buildings, hotels, other types of commercial developments popping up all around here and throughout here. This is definitely going to increase the pressure on here, increase the pressure for demolition of existing buildings, increase the pressure for the loss of an even greater reservoir of affordable housing in this adjacent area, where again, the people are of even lower income, people are even more predominantly Asian American, obviously, and where housing prices are overall even lower than they are in the SoHo NoHo area that we've been talking about. So to summarize, the city, let's compare the affordable housing that would be created versus the affordable housing that would be potentially threatened by the city plan. So the city claims 330 to 498 units of affordable housing are going to be built. In fact, I think a much more reasonable estimate is that it'll only be between 68 and 103 units, because about 80% of them, the zoning incentive is actually for commercial development. Now, by comparison, within the rezoning area, not the 7 census tracts, within the rezoning area, there are 635 units of affordable rent-regulated housing. Those will be threatened and come under a much, much, much greater degree of pressure, particularly in the areas with the biggest upzonings, what they're calling the housing opportunity zones, where the rent-regulated housing is disproportionately concentrated, along with the lower income people and the and people of color. And then just next door, there's even more, 1,200, roughly twice the number of rent-regulated units in just that tiny adjacent area in Chinatown, those couple of blocks right next to the biggest upzoning area, where it will also feel a significant amount of pressure. So Getting to the wrapping up part, I want to talk about our recommendations. So basically, as you can probably guess from what the study has shown, we think that there are three major flaws in the city's plan that should be corrected. First of all, it relies on an upzoning, which by its very nature incentivizes the destruction of existing affordable buildings, in this case, including 4 to 6 story residential buildings that in many cases include affordable rent-regulated housing. Secondly, the city's plan is entirely market-driven, and it's dependent upon the whims of developers and their for-profit construction to subsidize affordable housing development. So in other words, if a developer says, I don't want to build residential, I want to build commercial, they're just going to build commercial, it's no affordable housing. If they say, look, you know what, doesn't feel like the right time, I'm not sure, I'm going to wait this out, I don't really feel like taking the chance here, whatever, and developers do this all the time, there is no guarantee that any of the affordable housing is going to get built. For the city, there's even under the rosiest of projections, none of this is a guarantee. This is all the city saying, this is what we hope will happen. It's not approving it being built. It's approving changing the zoning system to hopefully allow for these things to happen. That's all. And in fact, in a lot of cases, what it's allowing to happen is going to be more likely commercial development than residential development. Finally, it makes the price for every unit of moderately affordable housing, the price you have to pay is 3 units of super luxury housing, which will have ripple effects of pushing out existing lower income tenants and incentivizing the destruction of more affordable housing. Now, we have a community alternative plan that basically would allow residential development in the neighborhood, but only at the same size that is currently allowed for new development in the neighborhood, with a mandate that it include affordable housing, much like the city is doing. We call for deeper affordability, meaning it should be accessible to people of even more modest means, and broader affordability, meaning more than just 25% of units. But we also call for direct subsidies to create new affordable housing and not leaving it just open to the market. But again, keeping everything within the scale of what's currently allowable for new development in the neighborhood, which is very, very generous. Anybody who knows new buildings that have gone up in SoHo and NoHo, a lot of them are not exactly shrinking violets. Some of them are 150, 200, even up to 300 feet tall. And that's what the existing zoning allows. So I want to point out, as the report does, what the city could do if instead of just relying on the market, they actually worked with affordable housing developers to develop real affordable housing, not 25% at these income levels that don't necessarily include a lot of people who need it, but built real affordable housing, 100%, 75%, 50%. These here are the 2 largest development sites in SoHo and NoHo, both owned by Edison Properties. One is on Lafayette and Lafayette Street. The other one is on Hester Street. So one in SoHo, one in NoHo. If the city or an affordable housing developer were to build purely affordable housing on these sites at the currently allowable size, not at the dramatic upzoning, but at the currently allowable size, the NoHo site you could build 133 units of affordable housing there, and at the SoHo site, 88 units. That is 221 affordable units, which is more than our analysis shows would be built in the entire city plan over 10 years. Is about 2/3 of what the city is projecting they say will happen, which is completely unrealistic and not based on facts. In addition to that, if you look in the southeastern section of the neighborhood, there's some sites that make sense for development. This open lot here on 6th Avenue, this parking garage here, these 1- and 2-story commercial buildings on Canal Street. These are buildings that are undoubtedly going to eventually get developed no matter what under the existing zoning. And we believe that they should be developed to the same density as the existing zoning allows. But if they were affordable housing, an additional 88 units of affordable housing could be built here. Now, by the way, this is just putting out there some examples of what could be done. It's not explicitly part of the community alternative plan, because we don't have the power to say, build this number of affordable units here. But this is something that the Village Preservation Study talks about to show how not relying on the market and not relying on an upzoning could actually be a much, much, much more effective way of getting much, much more affordable housing in appropriate locations where you're not demolishing people's homes, you're not demolishing existing affordable housing, and you could do it in a way that would keep it in scale and in character with the neighborhood. So finally, the last thing that I want to point out, which is part of the conclusion here, is one of the most important lessons that comes out of this is that the existing zoning, and we show this here, the existing zoning, which has been in place for a long time, basically incentivizes development on parking lot sites and in place of 1, 2, maybe 3-story commercial buildings. These 3 sites, by the way, have all already been developed, which is why we pictured them here. These are 2 in NoHo that still exist and could be developed, and probably at some point will be developed under the existing zoning. And for the most part, that's okay. None of these buildings are buildings that are of any great aesthetic interest, and they in most cases don't house anybody. I don't know for sure that there's no housing units on the top floor of these buildings, but if there are, we're talking about maybe 1 or 2. The proposed upzoning, what it does is it incentivizes the demolition of buildings like these, buildings that a lot of people live in, buildings that in a lot of cases have rent regulated units, loft law units, units that are at reasonable prices and that people of moderate income live in many cases. Not in all cases, but in many cases. And then finally, I just want to show this. This is a good way of summarizing what the city's proposed rezoning would do. So this building here, 25 Jones Street, this is an actual photograph. It's a relatively recently built building on Great Jones Street, just east of Lafayette Street. It was built at the maximum allowable size under the existing zoning. And as you can see, it lined up with, and actually, this is an old building. This is another new building. So the 2 new buildings basically stick up a little bit above existing buildings in the neighborhood, I think to an okay degree, right? So under the proposed rezoning, it would either be allowed to go up to 6 FAR. So this is a sort of superimposed image of what it would look like at 6 FAR, 9.7 FAR, or 12 FAR. These are the 3 new zoning districts or zoning densities that the city is proposing for SoHo and NoHo. This, by the way, is 10 FAR. This is what you could build if it was on Billionaires Row, where all of those huge, huge buildings are. In SoHo and NoHo, in the maximum upzoning areas, it could be 20% bigger and larger than that. And look at how much bigger it is than the buildings around it. So that is the end of my presentation, which went a little bit longer than I was anticipating, but there's a lot to say there. So I am going to switch over now to the Q&A section. And basically, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. And if you are dialing in, you can press *9, and we should be able to see you. So if you want to ask a question, raise a hand. You got to keep it brief because we've got 200 people here. We want to give everybody a chance to, as many people as possible, a chance. So keep it brief and make sure it's a question, and we will hopefully get to you. And if we don't, you can certainly follow up. Okay, let's see if I can. All right, so I am going to call on people who want to ask questions. All right, let's see if I can do this. All right, Kathy Slowinski, I am going to allow you to ask a question.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I'm just wondering, how does this development, incentive for development, what relation does this have to property taxes? And do you have any proposals for modifying or reforming the property tax laws?
It's a good question, and obviously a real one for people who own property in the area. We haven't made any particular proposal in terms of property taxes. What I can tell you is, obviously, if your property is upzoned, it's probably going to impact what its value is assessed to be, which may well affect what your property taxes are down the road. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this area. It's not really my area of expertise. Maybe we can have a follow-up conversation where I can try to get you some more information about that. But certainly, if you own a property where currently it's built as big as you're allowed to build it, and then suddenly the city changes the zoning where you could build something 2.5 times the size, that certainly affects the property value potentially. So, all right, I'm gonna move to the next question. This is gonna be from Bo Riccobono. So Bo, I'm giving you the floor.
Hi, Andrew.
Hey,
very impressive as usual. I just want to ask a very, it's a simple question. I just wonder if you can opine on this. The way you presented it's of course I'm on your side, but it's a no-brainer, right? It's a complete no-brainer. Why do you think the city is pushing this? I mean, and it's easy to say, well, it's the developers who are pushing the city and they contributed to de Blasio's campaign and all of that. I don't think it's as simple as that. So I'm wondering why you think the city is pushing this. And then we know that in city planning, we have a lot of strivers and people who are looking to their next jobs, and they're looking for positions at Edison Parking and the various developers around the city. So that's part of it. But I'm just wondering what you think is the true motivation behind this plan, because it seems to me on the face of it so ill-advised.
Right. Yeah, so I think there's probably a few motivations here. One is, as you said, that the mayor is clearly in bed with the real estate industry. He's gotten lots of contributions from Edison Parking and from a lot of other developers who are pushing up zonings here and throughout the city. I also think I think there's a genuine thirst on the part of a lot of people to do something about these issues, about equity, about affordability, about accessibility. And because the mayor has made it absolutely clear that the only way he will do these things is through massive upzonings. And the reason why he'll only do it that way is because that's the way the real estate industry wants it done, because they love this. They love this because even though they have to include affordable housing in certain cases when it's residential development, they get to build so much more new market rate housing that they're just swimming in the money. Even if they have to put some of it towards the affordable housing, they still make a killing compared to what they would make otherwise. So that's the only way the mayor is willing to do it, and he doesn't care what the effects will be. The fact that it's going to demolish existing affordable housing, that it's going to push people out of the neighborhood, that the ripple effects is that it's actually going to make the neighborhoods more expensive to live in, not less. But I think that for a lot of people out there, they just want to see something done, and the city is saying, this is the only thing we're going to do. So it's this or nothing. So there's a real push towards this type of change, not just in neighborhoods like SoHo and NoHo, but throughout the city. I think in part because people feel it's this or nothing, and I'd rather do something than nothing. But what they unfortunately need to realize is this is actually worse than nothing, unfortunately, but there is an alternative. The alternative is to create affordable housing without the upzoning, without the incentive for demolishing existing demolishing existing buildings, without the massive flood of very, very, very high-end market rate housing. And that's a way you can actually build more equitable neighborhoods in terms of the issues of affordability, diversity, equity, and also, by a wonderful coincidence, better in terms of preserving neighborhood character, in terms of the built environment and form, and not having these huge, hideous, out-of-scale new developments in place. So next, I'm going to call.
Well, just a quick follow-up, Andrew. I'm just wondering, though, that kind of affordable housing, who would finance that?
So the way it works is that under these plans, typically the developer, there's an affordable housing developer who provides the affordable housing in the market rate developments. So, and there's certain rules that are attached to it in terms of what can be built there. So, all right, I'm going to go to the next questioner, which is Jan Lee. So Jan Lee, please speak.
Hi, thank you. Such a fantastic presentation. What's missing from the presentation? I wonder if you could fill in the blanks here. It wasn't so long ago that New Yorkers were marveling at the fact that we had to have refrigerated trucks in front of hospitals as makeshift morgues, because we all realized that we have a severe deficiency in providing for our city's health needs. What in the city's plan accounts for hospital beds increasing, social services that are built into this plan, and an increased amount of health care for the low-income residents that are within the zone and bordering the zone? Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions. So as of right now, there's pretty much nothing addressing that. And the city does a notoriously bad job of addressing the infrastructure issues that come along with these rezonings. So when they do certify the plan, they are required to say, well, these are the impacts that we believe will be created by the plan. These are the increased needs, and these are how we're going to address them. So on the one hand, to be fair, they're not at that point yet where they have to say what that is. That will happen when they certify the plan, which is everybody believes is probably going to happen in April or around that time. But I would not be overly optimistic that it's going to address those issues in any sort of serious way because they have a terrible track record in terms of that, whether it's schools, whether it's hospitals, all other sorts of infrastructure. They do a really, really, really terrible job with that, unfortunately. I'm going to quickly jump over just to the Q&A if I can get in. Sam, for some reason, I can't get in and look at the Q&A. I wanted to maybe give a couple people from there.
I think it's because you have your screen share on. So if you turn that off, you'll be able to see everything.
Gotcha. Okay, let me see. Oh, this is new share, and I want to do that. Oh, your screen share. Okay, here we go. All right. So, all right. So there's a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I want to get. So Jan already asked his. Let's see. So an anonymous person asked, how are you conducting feedback from the local community? Have you met with the community boards yet? If so, which meeting and when? Thank you. Well, we've reached out to Community Board 2, and this is entirely within the bounds of Community Board 2. And we've asked them to allow us to make a presentation about the study to the board. I'm hoping to hear back soon with that. I plan on speaking at the full board meeting during the public session. So we are looking to partner with the community boards as much as possible. This clearly will have an impact on board 3 as well, because it directly borders board 3, although it's entirely outside of that community board. But it butts up right against it, and clearly there's going to be a spillover effect. I also see a question here that says, did you say that the southwest corner could produce 88 units? Please be more specific as to where. And that's from Frederica Siegel, who's from Community Board 2. So Frederica, if you look in the report, and this is for everybody, we identify exactly where they are. I showed you the images of those sites where it could take place. We're only looking at, and we've identified where either vacant lots, parking garages, or 1 to 2 story commercial buildings, all in that southwest corner, basically where Thompson Street intersects with Canal Street and just above there. But feel free to follow up with me afterwards if you want to have a more specific conversation about that. So let me see. So Susan Kaplan asked, has the city taken into account current times and the great possibility that there may be an incredible glut of square footage given the very high potential that many workers will not go back to working in an office, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, you know, one of the crazy things about the city rushing through this plan at this time is that we are really on the precipice of, you know, well, we've gone through obviously dramatic change because of COVID. And, we're hopefully returning to normalcy, but it's hard to know how much of things are going to go back to the way they were before and how much is going to change. And undoubtedly, there's going to be some change, probably significant change, and we just don't know what yet. For the city to say that they know how this is going to play out and what the impacts will be, what the market will be for commercial space, what the market will be for residential space in this neighborhood is just ridiculous. This is a rush job, and it's important to do something here. That's why we put forward this community alternative plan, but it's important to do it right. And it's impossible at this moment in time to really project what both the needs and the impacts are. So you point to the fact that there may be a greatly reduced need for office space, which is one of the things that I've heard people saying. So that means a lot of things. So people may not want to develop those commercial office buildings down here. On the other hand, there may be a ton of empty office space in the neighborhood that could be converted to housing. And by the way, one of the many downsides of the city's rezoning plan is that it discourages the conversion of office space or commercial space or manufacturing space to residential space, and particularly to residential space that includes affordable housing, which could be a great way of doing it. Now, on the other hand, I think it's not impossible to think that in the new post-COVID world, people are going to be less inclined to work in these huge, giant floor plate office buildings, but are going to be more interested in smaller offices, smaller office spaces. First of all, the office space needs won't be as great. And the type of smaller buildings that you have in areas like SoHo and NoHo, or that you could build smaller, by the way, meaning as compared to what's in Midtown and the financial district, under the rezoning plan, they could be pretty big, but smaller than what you have in terms of office buildings in Midtown or the financial district. There might be a huge demand for that. And so therefore, you may find that the competition in terms of building residential space is even greater from commercial than was anticipated, because working in that kind of environment may be even more desirable in a post-COVID world. It's very, very hard to say. One more from the Q&A. Alex, you asked, where could you find info on rent-regulated units? I thought info on that is not available for privacy reasons. No, that information, while it's, there's no one source, it's out there in many different sources, but rent-regulated units, though, that's a legal mechanism. They have to be recorded with the state. So that information is available. And if you go to our report where we refer to rent-regulated units, if you click on it, we take you to a document that shows you exactly where the rent-regulated units are located. Let's see. Gina says affordable units don't have to be in the new construction. They can be anywhere the developer decides. That's not the case here. That has been the case in the past with some rezonings, but to be fair, there's so many real things to criticize the city's plan for. I want to make sure we're accurate in our criticisms. The city's plan would require the affordable housing to be on site. There are a few cases, situations under which developers of residential buildings would be exempted from the affordable housing requirements. But for the most part, new housing construction would require the affordable housing to be on site. So just want to make sure. Michelle Varian asks, can the city buy the empty lots in order to have them developed for affordable housing? They absolutely could. They've done that. They just bought a building in downtown Brooklyn that they landmarked because it had an Underground Railroad history, something that activists in the neighborhood have been fighting for them to do for years. And then they bought the building from the owner in order to help make sure that it was preserved. If affordable housing is so important to the city as they claim it is, they should be willing to put some funding behind it as well, and to acquire some of this property. And hopefully, under the new regime in Washington, there'll be even more assistance for cities to do that. Roberta Gratz, who I know well, asks, what makes you think there's any interest on the part of the city to modify the proposal? There is no interest on the part of the city to modify the proposal, Roberta. We know that. They might make some changes. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this can't pass unless it's approved by council members Margaret Chin and Carlina Rivera. And we hope that they are reachable and that they will say to the city, it's really going to come down to them and to Borough President Brewer. And so we really have to put the pressure on them, reach out to them, let them know how important this is to us, that they have to do the right thing, and to say to these 3 elected officials who represent the area, who will get a vote on it, the borough president's is advisory, Margaret Chin and Carlina Rivera, the city council will defer to them, and the city council has to approve this in order for it to happen. They have the power to say to the mayor, you got to change it to what these folks are asking for, are calling for, to not incentivize the demolition of affordable housing, to not build grossly out of scale new construction, to not include the big box retail in it. You have to change it to that, or we are voting it down. And that is entirely within their power to do. So let me try to hit on, okay. Let me see who we have here. I am going to call on Laura Tenenbaum to ask a question. Laura, you're up.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you. And this has been a wonderful presentation and a great report. I just had a sort of a thought. I had taken part in the American Community Survey a few years ago, and I was struck by the fact that A, I couldn't report that I lived in a co-op, and B, I couldn't report that I lived in joint live work quarters for artists because they weren't contemplated in the survey or in the census. And I worry that the city, in relying on the census information, has not been able to get, and certainly they haven't gathered any other information about the artists and their families who live in NoHo and SoHo. Most of us, there are a younger generation here, but most of us are aging in place. I think that's one of the reasons that the median age in SoHo and NoHo is somewhat higher than the average for New York City. And I don't know whether that's being addressed either. Have you contemplated that or thought about how that kind of data could be gathered, or whether it's important or not?
Well, it's a great question. It's certainly important. The city has been an utter failure in terms of gathering this data. And let me say this, it would be a step up if the city was relying on census and American Community Survey data. They're not relying on it. They are skewing it. They are slicing and dicing it to suit the outcomes that they want to find. So one of the ways in which all of this came about was when they made their presentation and showed certain demographic and other data for the rezoning area, I decided to look it up myself because it didn't seem quite right to me. And when I looked it up, I saw it wasn't jibing with what I was finding. It was showing that the neighborhood was whiter than it was according to the data. It was showing that it was richer than it was, that the housing prices were higher than they were. So I reached out to city planning and I said, hey, where did this come from? And basically what they admitted after they were called out on it was that of those 7 census tracts that the rezoning area overlaps with, they only looked at 4 of the 7 because 3 of them, they didn't like what was in them. Basically, those are the census tracts that had the higher number of lower income people, the higher number of Asian American residents. They just didn't use them. And within the 4 census tracts, or maybe 5 that they did use, they decided which parts of it were more appropriately representative of the neighborhood and which weren't. So just to sort of clarify, using the census data would actually be an improvement over what the city actually did. But I agree with you wholeheartedly that this data about joint live work quarters and where the artists are living and exactly what kind of living situation they're in is vital to really understanding the landscape of these neighborhoods. And the city has not, and it's something that we should continue to call them out on and demand that they do. I There's a good question here in the chat that I'm just going to read out. Does the city council member have the final say on all ULURPs? Yes, as we discussed previously. Seems like the council race will be very important. Do you have any plan to hold any candidate forums? Do you know people running who are good on this issue? We're a 501c3, so we can't tell anybody who to vote for, but what we can do is hold candidate forums and have questionnaires for all the candidates, and we are in the process of doing that. And believe me, the SoHo NoHo rezoning is going to be one of the main questions that we ask people about and that we put them on the spot on. We will publicize their answers. These forums will be public, they'll be recorded, much like this is, and we will distribute it to the public. We will let you know what they say. We will let you know what their records are on these issues, because sometimes they say one thing but actually do another. And we will encourage everybody to vote. We won't tell you who to vote for, but we will give you good information that you can use to make decisions, and we encourage every member of the public, without a conversation about who you're voting for, to vote. So that is definitely a part of what we do. I see a question here from Anna Levy. What about upzoning the Broadway corridor and its effect on artists and other loft residents, many of whom rent and are senior citizens? Very good question. The city admitted in its scoping plan that it had not done a good job of documenting the number of people in this group. Yes, it's a perfect example of what the city has not done and what they've not taken a look at, and the fact that a lot of the people who live in the areas where they're proposing the biggest upzonings live in loft law or rent regulated, how to put tremendous pressure on them and their buildings to push them out. The city is just ignoring that. And I see a question here from Allie Ryan, and her hand is raised. What is the timeline of the SoHo NoHo plan to be approved or modified? So the first really formal step is that they do something called certification, which means they produce the actual final plan, they release it to the public, and then it starts the land use clock, which usually takes about 6 to 7 months. First thing it does is it goes to the community board, they hold a public hearing, they vote. Their vote is advisory. Then it goes to the borough president. The borough president may or may not hold a public hearing. She issues a recommendation. It's advisory. Then it goes to the city planning commission, which is controlled by the mayor. It will vote to approve. It always does. That's a foregone conclusion. Then it goes to the city council, the final stop. It can't be approved unless it's approved by the city council, and the city council will defer to the local council member, which in this case is Margaret Chin, as well as Carlina Rivera, who represents a fraction of the proposed rezoning area. They will be key. They have to stand up for their constituents. They have to recognize that this plan will make affordability worse. It will make equity worse. It will make diversity worse. And we're not saying just stick with what you have now. It's what you have or nothing. We are proposing a plan that would make things better and which is technically in scope or would be in scope, I believe, to what the city is proposing. And the council could modify it to do that. So it's not a matter of the status quo or nothing, or this horrible, horrible plan that would make matters worse. We can plan for a better future that preserves the artistic character of the neighborhood, that preserves the historic buildings, that preserves the scale, that preserves the affordable housing and the people who live in it, and creates and allows for the creation of new affordable housing in the neighborhood at an appropriate scale. As much, if not more, than what the city is proposing, and without destroying affordable housing in the process. That is what our community alternative plan would do. Since it's gotten, all right, I'm going to call on one last person, and that is Pete Davies. Pete, you are up. Pete,
thank you. Yeah. As you know, I sat on the advisory group representing Broadway Residents Coalition for the many months. Yep. And I too was quite shocked when the report came out because of the many differences that were put forward from what were discussed in that room. One thing that you mentioned was the increase in value that is granted to properties by the increase in FAR. We know that there has been a heck of a lot of speculative investment in the neighborhood. This is chronicled in the Rebney rent reports from biannual. over the last 15 years. It shows a distinct bubble that crested in 2016 and then has come down. But during that time, a lot of people bought buildings here and are now underwater. Do you know what the value of FAR is, of the FAR, by dollar per square foot, how one would calculate that?
I don't, but it's a good question. But what I will say in response to what you're saying is, I have no doubt that a lot of those developers and owners, for exactly the reason that you described, have been pushing for this rezoning or upzoning, because they know that they can make a lot of money off of the upzoning. They want those big box chain stores. They want to be able to build bigger buildings. They want to either tear down what they have. They want to add stories on top of it. They want to, they want all of the financial rewards that come with that. And that is really, I think at the end of the day, what is motivating this. Maybe we can talk more about trying to come up with some way of putting a specific dollar amount on it, but I'd be lying if I said that I had that now. There was one question in the Q&A that I wanted to respond to because it applies to sort of everybody here, and hopefully it's the question that's on everybody's mind, which is, what can I do to help? What can I do to promote the community alternative plan and push back and stop the city's plan? So in the chat, and maybe Sam, if it's possible, you can send it again. We included a link to where you can send letters to every one of the relevant elected officials saying you oppose the city's plan. It would make our neighborhoods less equitable, less affordable, less diverse. You support the community alternative plan. You demand that they drop the current plan, that they pursue our plan. Share this information with your friends and neighbors. Arm yourself with information. At these meetings, they count on you. They count on throwing a lot of stuff at you and you not knowing what any of it means, and trusting their information and trusting their judgment. We have to arm ourselves with the real information so that we can say, that's wrong. You're not going to be making the neighborhood more affordable. You're going to be making it less affordable. You're not going to be making the neighborhood more diverse. You're going to be making it less diverse. So please, if nothing else, make sure you send those letters and ask every one of your friends and neighbors to do so. We do expect the plan is going to be certified pretty soon. And once that happens, we're going to call everybody out for the public hearings and the meetings that are going to take place. We may well be doing some rallies and some other stuff. By sending those letters, as well as by signing up for tonight's meeting, we have a way of keeping in touch with you, and we will do that. And we will certainly let you know how you can be involved. All right, it's an hour and 45 minutes in. I promised people that I would actually end this at an hour and a half, so I'm going to end now. Feel free to follow up with me directly about any of this. I want to thank the 200 or so people who participated tonight, all of our co-sponsors, the elected officials who were able to speak, the elected officials who weren't, but who have been in touch with us about this, the elected officials who we haven't heard back from yet. I am hopeful that we will, and that they will have a serious dialogue about these issues. It's not just the future of SoHo and NoHo and Chinatown, which is included in this, although the city pretends it's not. It is the future of all of our neighborhoods, because the city has made very, very clear that what they are seeking to do in SoHo and NoHo, they want to replicate throughout the city. This is the nose of the camel, and we have to stop it here, and not just stop it and say, you know, keep things exactly as they are, because the way things are is not perfect. But the city's way of going about it is just going to make it worse. We together can push forward a much better future for our neighborhood that maintains all of the things that we care about, from equity and affordability to the historic character, the artistic character, the cultural vitality, and that's what this is all about. So thank you so much, everybody, and we will continue to be in touch with you about all of this. And I look forward to hearing from you directly if you have any questions that I haven't answered. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good night.